Yeah.
So Pete, thank you so much for being a guest on my podcast, Therapy for Guys. I'm really grateful that we get this opportunity to connect, even though we're time zones apart.
Oh, yes, great to be here. I discovered you because you interviewed someone who we have mutual respect for, Richard Boothby, and I really enjoyed that interview. And then, yes, I don't know if I mentioned it on Twitter or I don't know, or you maybe reached out on Twitter, but it was great to connect. I didn't know about your work until then, and it's exciting to see what you're doing.
Man, I really appreciate that. Coming from someone of your caliber, it means a lot that you even listened to it and enjoyed it. Yeah, I have a good friend, shout out to Nate Dickerson, who emailed me when he found out that I was interviewing Richard Boothby and said, "Hey, you got to check out this guy. He's actually doing like a reading group in a couple weeks. I think you guys would probably connect." And I was like, "Man, I gotta check him out and reach out." And I'm just glad that yeah, we did that.
Brilliant, brilliant. Yeah, I think I know Nate. I know Nate. I can't remember his surname, so I'm guessing it's the same guy. So
Okay.
thank you for connecting us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, okay, Pete, what I was hoping we could do is I really want to highlight some of the major things that you're up to, like reading groups that you do, events that you host and are a part of. And through that, maybe we can get into some of the ideas which animate you, I think, which animate me, and just see where the conversation goes.
Wonderful. I'm excited to do it.
So, okay, I saw on social media that you just did kind of a reading discussion group on John Paul Sartre, Existentialism as a Humanism. And,
Yes.
and I'm just curious if you could kind of highlight some of the nuggets from that experience and that book and maybe see where we go with that.
Oh yeah, okay, that's interesting. So yeah, my work it's always been very freelance. And so I work with people who are just interested in ideas, interested in philosophy, interested in psychoanalysis, theory, theology, whatever. And as part of that, I do reading groups and discussions. And as you say, the most recent one was actually on a short essay by Sarte on existentialism is a humanism. And I chose that because he wrote it 2 years after Being in Nothingness, like his major text.
Sure.
And it's an attempt really by him to sum up his view of existentialism. And it's quite a controversial article and it's maybe a little bit simplistic at times, but it's a really good starting place for Sartre. And I do like existentialism a lot because, I mean, something we might talk about is, but what I'm interested in is the different strains of theory that really attempt to fight against the dehumanization of subjectivity that
Mm.
kind of like reduce us to mechanisms or machines. A thinker I quite like is a guy called Gabriel Marcel, who
Oh,
once
yeah.
said, oh yeah, Marcel, yeah.
Sure.
And he said, the question people ask is, are computers ever going to be like us? And he says, well, yes, they are, but not because they're becoming more like us, but because we're becoming more like them. We treat ourselves as machines, optimizing, life hacking, trying to kind of like treat ourselves as these production machines. And
Sure.
so yeah, so existentialism is one of those traditions that attempts to fight against that. And I guess if you want me to just say the main bit of that article,
Yeah,
uh,
please.
yeah, and this is where like Sartre is quite different from psychoanalysis in some ways, but the main thrust of the article really is that he says that an existentialist is someone who, and he uses three terms. He says embraces anguish, abandonment, and despair.
Mm.
And he says these are really positive things. I was like, right, those. They think they're negative, but he says so. He says anguish is the idea that you have to take responsibility for the decisions you make.
Mm.
You can't ever kind of say, oh, someone else made me do it. We want to go to a palm reader or a fortune teller or someone who'll tell us what to do. Sartre says there is a certain anguish in that you always are the one who's responsible for what you do. Um,
Mm.
he actually uses Abraham and Isaac as a good example because he says, listen, Abraham hears from God, kill your son. And you'd think that that would be the ultimate way of at least advocating your responsibility. But he says, listen, even if you believe in God and you believe God speaks to you, if you hear that voice, you still have to decide whether it's God or a devil or some sort of neurosis. So
Right.
even when you can't advocate your responsibility, and that's
Mm,
anguish, abandonment is connected, and it's the idea that we have to choose what we do morally
mm,
without any compass. There's a certain sense in which whether, and he uses a brilliant example of a young student of his who says, yes, my brother died during the Second World War. My brother was killed by the Nazis, and I want to go and fight them. I have to go over to the UK, to Britain, to join the British soldiers in fighting Nazism. But he says, but also my mother is bereft. She's lost one of her sons. And if I leave, she might lose both sons. And that
right.
would be devastating to her. And he says to Sartre, what should I do? Should I have a massive part of this one person's life or a very small part of a world historical event? And Sartre basically says, you have to make the decision in fear and trembling, and there's a
Mm,
certain abandonment, as in where we don't have something in the stars that we can look at. And then finally, despair just means that when we give ourselves to a cause, we have to realize that the cause may never be fulfilled. And
mm.
there's a certain despair because you cannot rely on the historical movement or a teleological dimension of the universe that will ensure that whatever cause you give yourself to will win. You have to decide to fight for something without knowing how it's going to end up.
Oh, that's really good. You know, one of the things that comes up just in my work, I don't know if you know, I'm a psychotherapist working with a lot of, I work with a lot of adolescents, but then a lot of young men and older males as well. And sometimes they'll come in and they'll say, "You just got to tell me what to fucking do.
Yes.
Just give me the formula, and I think I'll be good." And we have to have a very deep conversation about how that's not how therapy works. It's how life works. You've got to take responsibility and kind of figure it out. So that resonates with me so much.
That reminds me, Lacan once said that the temptation the therapist has to resist is to give the analysand what they want. And
Mm.
kind of what the analysand wants is in many ways you to fix them and you to tell them what you should do. And the temptation is huge, I'm sure, sometimes, especially if you see somebody making idiotic decisions.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah. So
Myself included.
exactly, absolutely. But the difference between obviously counseling and therapy is in therapy, especially in therapeutic analysis, is that you kind of have to resist the temptation to give the person what that student wanted. That student wanted Sarte to say you should do X, Y, or Z, and only in resisting that can you get something much more interesting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, another dynamic too, whether it's they're wanting to do a lot of small talking or they're just wanting these quick answers, I think a part of my role is to help them be okay with the awkwardness and the distress and the fact that life doesn't work out very well all the time.
I
To
mean, you
develop a
could
capacity for that.
absolutely. I mean, to simplify, but initially is like in one way the cure for neurosis. The ultimate, what is the cure? It's always a very interesting subject in analysis. Is what does it? What does the cure mean? And one way of thinking about the cure is the point when the person comes to terms with the contradictory nature of life and their desires, and really instead of trying to find a way to have an answer, to find a way to inhabit the questions and the contradictions and you say the awkwardness. And if you're able to genuinely do that, um, there is something curative about that
Oh
position.
yeah, absolutely. I think when I had a conversation with Todd McGowan, who I think you really
Oh,
appreciate as well, you know,
he's a real hero. By the way, I wanted to say both Todd McGowan and Richard Boothby are, I think, searingly brilliant intellectuals and also very, very kind and generous people. Yeah.
well,
It's
and
always
honestly,
nice to know that whenever you respect someone, that they're actually really nice as well.
oh my gosh. I mean, I'm so glad you're saying that because that's been my experience. You know, in some ways, I'm a nobody. I'm just a therapist down here in Houston, but they've connected with me, and I think we've really appreciated talking about these amazing ideas. And I'm getting the same energy from you. So thank you for being open and willing to just discuss these things because I, I think it's important.
Yeah. Can I tell you a story about Todd very quickly? Do you
Please.
listen? Then we'll get back to Todd.
Yeah, absolutely.
So he spoke at an event I run. I do this festival called Wake, and he came over to it. And the hilarious thing was, so, and he said yes. He was like so generous, like, yeah, I'll come. And I kept trying to figure out, so, how much will it cost, and how much do you want, and all of this. And he never, if I asked three questions, and one of the questions was, well, how much is this going to cost? He never answered that question. He only answered the other questions. And, I was kind of nervous, going, oh, I'll make sure we've got a budget to be able to do this. And just discovered that he has just got zero interest in finances and money, like zero. And it's really interesting to me because I don't know if you've read his book Capitalism and Desire.
I haven't. I'm currently reading Enjoyment, Right and Left, which I was hoping we could kind of get into a little bit, but
Oh yeah, I'd love to do that as well. And yeah, so but Enjoyment, Right and Left. I haven't read that one, but I know the argument. But the book Capitalism and Desire is wonderful. But in that, he talk about how do you libidinally disinvest from the frenetic pursuit of more and more. We live in what a very interesting thinker, Byung-Chul Han, he wrote a book called Burnout Society. But he shows how, and we all see this on Instagram, is we're all being told that we can do it, that we have to optimize, we have to maximize, we can achieve, we have to seize the day, and all of this stuff that creates these very modern symptoms such as fatigue and burnout and ADHD. But
right.
his argument is, in a way, like, so Todd McGowan talks about how do we actually libidinally disinvest from this frenetic pursuit that actually causes so many modern symptoms. And actually, Todd McGowan's own personal life, he kind of lives it. He doesn't just talk about it. He's got this complete disinterest in kind of like, he wants to obviously get by and do that, and he's fine.
Sure,
but above and beyond that, he has no interest. And so it took me so much to actually give him any money. It's like, I've never had to work so hard to give someone money in my life.
Sure. No, that's awesome. So I think I don't know if it was on Why Theory or somewhere I heard him say that if he found like a shit ton of money on the side of the street, he actually wouldn't pick it up. And I've kind of adopted that. My wife thinks I'm full of shit, that if I did find it, I actually would take it. And I tell my clients the same thing. Look, it would actually probably solve a lot of problems in my life that I don't want solved.
Oh, yes. That's a good answer. That's a good answer. Yeah, but my favorite TV show is called Peep Show, and I recommend it to everybody. Best written comedy I think ever. But there was a moment where the two main characters, Mark and Jez, are locked in this house, and they're talking, and Jez, who's kind of more of the silly guy, but he's asking Mark, so here, let's pass the time. He says, if we were in France, during the war, would you have joined the resistance? And Mark, who's a very serious guy, he's like, oh, well, I'd like to say yes, but probably realistically no. And of course, Jez turns around and says, oh, you're an asshole. He says, I would have definitely done. He says, no, I would have driven down and I would have assassinated Hitler. And, of course, the idea, of course, he wouldn't. But with Todd, when someone says, oh, I would leave the money on the side of the road, you go like, yeah, really?
Yeah.
But with Todd, I actually believe he would.
Okay. He's not full of shit, even though I am.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yes.
So, okay, Pete, would you mind going back real quick to Sarte and talking about what he means by bad faith? Because I think that's an important concept.
Oh, yeah. So bad faith in a nutshell for Sarte is really not taking, well, in light of abandonment, anguish, and denial, it's
Yes.
the refusal to acknowledge those. It's the attempt to deny that. He so he uses a couple of great examples. He's very good at examples, and very famously, you'll know, he said one was a waiter, a Parisian waiter, who was so Parisian and so like doing everything a waiter would do in such an exaggerated and perfect form. And Sartre was saying, well, this guy actually thinks he's a waiter. And that's kind of bad faith, because a waiter is not a waiter. Whatever you are, whoever you are, you bleed out of that. In fact, that's what makes us human. A rock is a rock, a dog is a dog. But a human is someone who is defining what it is to be human in all your actions and all your decisions. So there's this radical freedom, and he says we're condemned to freedom. I love that phrase. He
I
doesn't
love that
say,
phrase too.
it's brilliant, isn't it? Because we think freedom, oh, it's amazing, and America, fight for your freedom, and we love freedom. Sartre's like, no, you're condemned to freedom. And that it's terrifying. It's the last thing we want. We often want totalitarian leaders to tell us what to do. We put our own restrictions on ourselves. And fascinatingly, the more free a society is, in inverted commas, the more anxiety it produces, and then the
Mm,
more people put weird and strange prohibitions on themselves. So I used to live in LA, and in LA, where you can date anybody you want, you can have sex with whoever you want, there's all of this freedom. And then most people are not dating anybody and are in a
mm,
loop, and are not, they basically are, the anxiety that's produced from all of this freedom creates its opposite. And people start to put on these very, very crazy prohibitions that stop them from connecting. So yeah, so bad faith for Sartre, I think in a nutshell, is not taking responsibility. Another great example he used, he saw a man and a woman having, I think it was having dinner, and the man reached over to the woman's hand and he squeezed it. He squeezed her hand, and Sartre watched to see what the woman would do. So the woman, had a couple of choices. One is that she might very politely withdraw her hand. So this is a dating scenario. And by
gotcha.
withdrawing her hand, that's a very subtle signal, I'm not interested. Or she could squeeze his hand back, which would be a very subtle signal of, yes, I like this advance. But he said, but in this scenario, she let her hand lie limp,
Mm,
neither moving it nor squeezing, in order to kind of, in one sense, try to avoid having to act. Now, Sartre would say you can't avoid acting, so even that's an act. But he would say that it's kind of bad faith if you try to avoid, taking responsibility for your life and your decisions.
yeah. What was this Sartre who said existence precedes essence?
Yes,
Okay,
yes, yeah.
what do you think he meant by that? Like, if you were to kind of practically reflect on that, how do you understand that?
Yeah, so he uses that to define the very essence of existentialism for him. And it basically means, right, if I make a table, the essence precedes the existence. So the table is in my mind. I
Mm,
know what the table is for, and I can make the table. And a dictionary is full of essences. So the idea of a dictionary is it tries to define what an umbrella is, what a cup is, what a piece of art is. These essences that come before potentially the existence of something. In fact, in terms of an invention, somebody might have a concept, and then of course they create that concept, they create it. But Sartre says human beings are different, that there is no essence. What you do is you exist, and then as you act in the world, you actually choose your essence. So very radically, this is also what he means by you're condemned to freedom. He says you're responsible for who you are, which is quite a beautiful and profound thing. He says
mm,
your essence. And maybe only at the end of your life could somebody actually say, well, this is who Pete was, right? This is his life. But that didn't pre-exist me. That what I created, what I achieved, or what I didn't achieve didn't pre-exist me. Through my free decisions, my essence arises.
wow. So, okay, one of the things that's coming up for me that I'd love your help with is, do you think some of this philosophical reflection has anything to say to like masculinity or gender?
Ah,
Because that's something I end up kind of thinking about and working on in therapy. I'm all over the place sometimes on that, but as you were talking about, you know, existence preceding essence, and even the different roles that we play. I mean, so much of masculinity is problematic. What are some of your thoughts on that?
okay, that's interesting. I'd love to think about it with you then, because that's
Okay.
not something I've thought about explicitly. But it definitely probably has things to say. I know, like for example, I do know that there is a real um, uh, kind of plague of uh, what do they call it? The plague of despair, basically suicide among men. I mean, there's
Right.
a huge number of men who commit suicide. I think it might be 3 times more than women. And there was a study that looked at suicide notes, and it looked at suicide notes of men and what were the last words that they wrote.
Mm,
And a lot of them talked about feeling useless. There was a sense of feeling completely useless, not having meaning, not having purpose. And so that's interesting. I just heard that research very recently. So I'm just kind of haven't processed it too much,
Sure, sure.
but potentially we live for whatever reason, in our contemporary society, there is some sort of dearth of young men finding meaning and purpose, and feeling useful, and feeling they have something to contribute. There's something about existentialism that is beautiful in that. Now, existentialism is an old movement, and I think, there's certain things we can pull apart, but the
Sure.
best of what we're talking about is a message of you are free, you can make your meaning, choose who you want to be, that you're not the victim of forces around you. That, of course, we're all put in a situation, right? Some of us might be born blind, or born in a feudal society, or born
Sure.
in various places. So there's limits that are external to us. But Sartre says that whatever scenario you find yourself in, uh, you can choose your morality, choose who you want to be. And so there's probably within existentialism, and I think it's why it was so liked by people,
Mm,
is that there was something in it that in a society of mechanization, and where we're all just kind of like tools plugged into a system, something about kind of taking responsibility for your life. You even
mm.
see that today in some of the YouTubers that are online, who are very well liked by men. Now, some of
Sure.
them are very controversial.
Oh,
um,
like Jordan Peterson and Andrew
yes,
Tate.
yes, exactly. So Andrew Tate's an interesting one. We'll take it because there's because the question is, like, for someone like, for us, and for people listening to this podcast, it's
Sure.
not whether you like or dislike Andrew Tate. It's why is what he's saying resonating? Who's it resonating with? And trying to understand that. Because you could live in a society where someone like Andrew Tate would, not generate any interest, right? But
Right.
we live in a society where he's generating a lot of interest. So what is it? And I think it connects with some of these issues
I
of
think you're right.
what we see in the suicide notes. And yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. No, well, no, I really love the angle that you had. I think what I was kind of wanting to highlight was just I don't think there's an essence of what a real man is supposed to be. Why I like the existential kind of move is I know he wasn't an existentialist, but I have this quote from Jung, one of Freud's students, and he said, I am not who. What does he say? He says, I am not what has happened to me. I am who I choose to become.
Yeah,
And
yes,
there's just something about that gives a person agency and some creativity and freedom to kind of shape who they're going to become. And I think that's a message that could be powerful for men who get stuck in this idea that you have to be a certain kind of way.
yes, no, absolutely. Now, here's the interesting thing then is, um, so for Sartre, and agency is very key. Use that word.
Yes.
And existentialists, they're part of the tradition, especially in continental thought, that try to show that there is freedom and novelty, and openness within subjects and within the universe, because it's very easy to be deterministic and think everything kind of just happens through
Sure.
some sort of like cause and effect, right? And so there is this very, very strong tradition of embracing agency and freedom. The interesting thing about Sartre, he did not like the unconscious, the
Right. And
Freudian
that's where I
unconscious.
fundamentally disagree with him on.
Yes, this gets us to a really interesting discussion about what freedom is. What freedom is to
Yes.
someone, what freedom is to someone like Freud or Lacan, because for and the Lacanian notion of freedom is potentially a lot more disturbing than
Mm,
the Sartrean notion of freedom, but there still is freedom. Uh, but the Sartrean notion of freedom feels much more about your consciousness, your ego, your sense of you. Now, he wouldn't quite say it like this, but it's kind of the choices you make, the decisions you make. Um, the Lacanian unconscious means that we're kind of infused with a type of contradiction,
absolutely.
a kind of death drive that throws us off. That sometimes we find ourselves doing something and we go like, that isn't me. That what? Why did I do that? And in psychoanalysis, that's kind of the moment of freedom. The moment of freedom is when your life is turned completely upside down, not through your own volition, but it almost feels like even falling in love, something like that. When this happens and you feel that it's something beyond your control, that disrupts you, explodes your world. So freedom there is this moment in which you as a subject are thrown off the tracks of your life and thrown onto a new track.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but it feels very much not like the agency of like someone like Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson.
Sure.
It's something else. Yeah.
Sure. No, this is why, even though I have that quote on my wall, it's kind of a paradox. I'm also always telling my clients the William Faulkner quote, the past isn't dead, it's not even past.
Oh yes.
Right, that we're haunted by these like inner ghosts, and we can't ever escape them, I don't think.
Yes.
You,
I
you,
came across that quote today. That's a very interesting thing.
that's a synchronicity.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know I'm not a Jungian, but I'll go with it for this one because that's a weird synchronicity. What was I reading? It's the opening quote. Oh yeah. Oh, I know. Oh, that I'm embarrassed now to say because it's
Oh no, you got
um
to say it, man.
gotta say, well, I'm reading this for research, not
Okay.
out of personal interest. It was Harry's book Spare, Prince Harry,
Oh, okay.
Meghan Markle's Harry.
Oh
So
yeah,
I think
yeah.
it opens with that quote. So yeah, so I'm interested in what's going on culturally with everything. So yeah.
Sure. Thinking through the unconscious, where I see it come out is, and some colleagues that I have that aren't sort of into psychoanalysis kind of laugh at me, but it's the Freudian slip,
Oh,
which
oh,
happens all the time in therapy. It's some of the best fucking material that I get to work with.
yeah, the
And
Freudian.
people are like, "Wait, what? No, I didn't mean that." Like, well, hold on a second. Let's explore that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so that's why psychoanalysts are fundamentalists. They're literalists in a religious sense. I like just like the fundamentalist kind of doesn't care what the author intended. They care about what's said. The
Mm,
analyst doesn't care about what you mean. They care about what you said. But like, I know you meant to say your mother, but you said your girlfriend's name, right? I know now
right.
we know what you intended, but let's forget about what you intended and let's look at what you literally said. And
Mm.
as you know, like, and I'm just interested in psychoanalytic theory, but I mean, my friends probably hate me for it, but I'm so painfully aware of Freudian slips, and they happen all the time.
Me too.
As you start to orient yourself to them, you hear people. Oh, people sometimes. Some people can't get through a conversation without doing a Freudian slip, and the slip is what, for your viewers, the slip is kind of, in a sense, the slippage of a truth. Something is getting said that the person doesn't intend, they're not consciously aware of, but still something is being communicated, and it's kind of forcing itself out. Yes.
Absolutely. So, okay, you did the Sarte reading group. I know later this month, at the end of January, you're going to have some time with Richard Boothby discussing his incredible book, which I know you've mentioned, Embracing the Void, Rethinking the Origin of the Sacred. I would love to just hear what that book meant to you, how it helps you think about, the sacred, religion, all the wonderful stuff that he gets into.
Great. Yeah. So my vocation, my work really is mostly in kind of religious theory and religious practice. So that's kind of where I cut my teeth and what I do. And I'm particularly interested in, well, so I'm not confessionally religious, I'm not institutionally religious or anything like that. Um, uh, but I'm exploring a form of Christianity that is very similar to Slavoj Žižek, Todd
Yeah.
McGowan, and Richard Boothby. So it's an M. So I've been doing this, but primarily I was interested and I'm interested in what can be called a type of liturgy, a
Mm,
type of kind of immersive artistic experience that you put yourself into that helps orient you to the other, right?
mm.
Now, what if I can define religion, which is, it would take us all day, but I'm going to do it in a nutshell. You could say that religion at its best is it tarries with otherness or
Mm,
the real. So religion at its best is an attempt to orient oneself collectively to something that is we could call otherwise than being. So we've got our everyday life, we've got what's going on, but you have a sense of something that cannot be rendered into kind of words or experience. And religions, to a greater or lesser extent, are like that. Now, science also orients itself to an otherness, an unknown, which is, well, you know, like the scientist is in whatever discipline they're in, often trying to discover something they do not know. But religion kind of redoubles that, because religion at its best is saying there might be an otherness that is not simply something that is currently other, but that we could render into language and experience, we could understand, make it into the same, right? But there's something fundamentally other, something that we fundamentally cannot conceptualize or properly experience. And so I think this is deeply important philosophically, because I'm trained as a philosopher primarily, but this idea that there is a type of otherness that we need to stay open to is kind of key. But my main interest is not that this is substantive necessarily. So my interest in psychoanalysis is also interested in its kind of, especially its French form, is also interested in tarrying with and orienting ourselves to some sort of fundamental unknown dimension of reality. So with my own work, I'm interested in philosophy, religion, and psychoanalysis, and bringing them together in a form of practice. And Richard Boothby's book is, you know, as close to kind of the theory that I'm trying to expound as I've found. Well, it's that, and say Zizek and McGowan. And what Boothby does brilliantly is he shows, especially he's Lacanian, I'm Lacanian, he shows that fundamental to our infancy and in our adult lives is we're interested in desire. We're interested in the desire of the other. So you could say the most precious material in the universe isn't gold or isn't health or whatever. It's actually the desire of the other. I desire the other's desire. I desire to be the object of the other's desire. Now, not just that. So there's about 4 different ways. René Girard's very brilliant on this. But
I love Girard.
Oh, he's great undiscovered. Like he's big, but he's not as big as he should be.
Yeah.
And his theory of desire is, I think, you know, everybody who's interested in desire has to tarry with his work, you know. And so he would say, you know, so I desire you. I desire your desire.
I desire you too. I'm just kidding.
Oh, I know. So it's something got very personal there.
Yeah.
But I also, you know, if we're friends, I start to also desire what you desire. So I look at what you're looking at. And I know Boothby talked a little bit about this, but it's called joint attention, where an infant will suddenly become interested not in their mother, but in their mother's gaze. Where's the gaze going? And they start to take an interest in what the other wants. Or I start to desire to be you, to become you, like obsession, or to overcome you, like in rivalry. So actually, this is why René Girard calls original sin desire, because it's the original sin, because desire is kind of fundamentally who we are. And fundamental to desire is jealousy and envy, obsession and rivalry. You can't have desire without elements of those erupting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And desire then, in a nutshell, is weirdly what the other lacks. So if I'm oriented to your desire, I'm oriented to precisely what you don't have, because you desire what you don't have, right? So I'm orienting myself to a type of lack that is within you. And at a basic level, fantasy can be seen as my attempt to work out what it is you desire, or how I can be desirable to you. So the child's always trying to figure out, how can I be desirable to the parents? And they're finding out how they fit in the parents' desire. Fantasy is kind of, in a sense, what enables that. So in psychoanalysis, if we take this notion of subjectivity, to be human is to be oriented to a dimension of the other that is unknown. and more radically, not just unknown to me, but unknown to them, because their desire isn't substantive. Your desire is also kind of like provoked and evoked through the desire of others. So there's no substantive person who just desires, who just knows what they want without being influenced by anybody, right?
Mm,
All of our desire is like this map. And so that, in one sense, I'm exploring the idea of Christianity
mm,
as type of orientation and openness to the other, to the neighbor, and to the enemy, to the unknown dimension of the other, as a type of religious practice.
mm. Are you into things like radical theology, John Caputo? The reason I bring that up is I guess I'm no longer interested in like a God in the sky, but I do find value in kind of his statement, God doesn't exist, he insists.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I was very
Does that
influenced.
resonate with you?
Oh, yeah. So I'm very influenced by radical theology.
Okay.
So I would be in the tradition of radical theology and was very influenced by John Caputo, who, like Todd McGowan and Richard Boothby, is not only a Syrian intellect, but a most beautiful and generous man who,
Mm,
I'm very lucky to have been able to kind of become, be associated with, become friends with. And
sure.
his work
Wow.
was definitely very influential. Now, the funny thing is, in my 30s, in my early 30s, I was and late 20s, very influenced by Derrida, Caputo, that post-structuralist radical theology.
Sure. I went through that phase too.
Oh, yes, there you go. Yeah. So now I kind of like, I'm in the kind of Shizekian, Lacanian, Hegelian. Um,
That's where I'm finding myself as well.
Yeah, well, I guess that obviously by who you've been interviewing recently.
Okay.
So I'm going, oh, great, we've got you. You still
Yeah.
like you, so we're gonna, that's going to be an interesting
At
thing
some
to.
point, I would love to discuss that because we don't have to now, but I think I did some pretty deep, it wasn't analysis, it was just psychotherapy with a Jungian, but it was more the post Jungian James Hillman. It was the non-fundamentalist Jungs because there's some Jungians out there that sound as religious in kind of a negative way as some of the most fundamentalist Christians, and
Yeah, well,
so
that's the same with Lacanians. They're even
okay.
worse. I mean, my podcast partner and very close, one of my closest friends, Elliot Morgan, who very sadly he lives in LA. I've moved back to Belfast, so we're only hanging out online. But a dear, dear friend, he's my podcast partner. He's a Jung. He kind of got more and more into Jung. He kind
Got
of
you.
got into this theory because of me, because
Okay.
I was a bit older than him. Got it, but then he kind of like he branched off into Jung. So now we're always having discussions about Jung and Freud.
Got you. Yeah, no,
I'm
it
always
is.
trying to win him back.
I have all these like Jung quotes on my in my office, and I'm thinking, damn, I'm gonna have to like take some of it down and put some Freud shit up there and some Lacan stuff. So.
Do you want to know that I think the main difference is now between Jung and Freud and the kind of
Yeah,
post-Freudians,
sure.
like I think because there's loads of good stuff in Jung, obviously, and I think in terms of kind of depth psychology and doing kind of analysis with a Jungian, it's like it doesn't matter if they're in the Winnicott, if they're and if
Right.
Freud or Lacan, if they're a good analyst, they're a good analyst, and often the techniques, as you know, are like look quite similar in practice.
Yes.
It's more like theoretical differences, and as I'm trained primarily in terms of theory, my training in psychoanalysis is theoretical. And funnily enough, I'm more interested in psychoanalysis for its theoretical insights rather than its practical usages, I have to say.
Sure.
um, but I did do psychoanalysis with Bruce Fink for a couple of
Oh
years.
wow.
Yeah, because he was always a bit of a hero. I always liked his work. So yeah, I did undergo analysis with him.
I actually in your the last I think podcast I'm sorry to interrupt you. You made a
Oh,
phenomenal comment about and maybe I don't know if it was Fink, but you enjoying the lows in your relationship also as well as the highs. I just thought that was so good.
oh yeah, that was really good. That was actually because I briefly also did analysis with a woman called Patricia Garavici, and
Oh my
that
God.
was.
I'm originally from Puerto Rico. So in grad school, I did a paper on her book, The Puerto Rican Syndrome.
Oh no way.
That's
Yeah,
crazy. Okay.
yeah. So yeah, I did not, and that was one of the few things she said to me because they're pretty harsh Lacanians. They short session or variable length session. But I had some sessions that were 5 minutes long.
Oh
It was
wow, man. Dude,
But
on a busy day like I have, that sounds nice.
I know, absolutely. Get home early. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. What were we saying about those guys? Uh,
Now I
what were
can't
we?
remember,
Oh, yeah.
but I think,
Jung and Freud.
oh, that's right.
That's right. Ah, yes. Oh well. Very quickly then. What I think is, oh yeah, that Jung really has this notion of balance, obviously yin and yang, anima, animus, conscious, unconscious, light and dark, chaos, cosmos. So there's very much balance. And in Jung's papers on the unconscious, there's really a deep sense in which what you kind of like, if you're say hyper masculine for argument's sake, then yes, in the unconscious will arise a type of opposite to
Right.
almost try to kind of bring balance back. But what happens is, so maybe you'll have a dream in which you're a woman or something like that, or do
Yeah.
something feminine, right? So that comes back, and Jung kind of talks about this balance between, say, the conscious and the unconscious. That's my reading of Jung.
Sure.
Whereas for Lacan and coming out of Freud, Freud's obviously kind of got a few different theories working, but
Hmm.
coming out of Freud is the idea that the unconscious isn't something. It's not the other side of consciousness or another substantive entity. The unconscious at its most radical is the cut within subjectivity. So it's there, all there is the subject and the cut, uh, which means there's not two. The subject is not two. The subject is not one. Or
Mm.
Trinitarian, you could say, because the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, like God is not God, and the split is the Holy Ghost. So, but they're not three or two or one. They're kind of a not one. That's kind of like a Lacanian
That's
notion of the unconscious.
fucking incredible. Have you read Alenka Zupanchik's What is Sex?
Oh yes,
You
yes,
know,
yes.
she has that phrase in there that she kind of builds on. I think it's in line with what you're saying. She calls it we're, the with without,
Yes, yes, yes.
and that is just powerful.
Yeah, I think a great example from back in Belfast, where I'm from, is that our second biggest city is called, well, it's got two names. And during the Troubles, depending on whether you were a loyalist, kind of Protestant, or a nationalist, or Catholic, you would call it Londonderry or Derry, right?
Mm.
So it was one city, had two names. And journalists would say Derry stroke Londonderry. So on the news, so as not to offend anybody, they would say Derry stroke Londonderry. And then there was a famous radio broadcaster here who started calling it Stroke City, right? So instead
Mm.
of Derry Stroke London, Derry Stroke City. And that for me is the unconscious, is the stroke in Derry Stroke London Derry. There is one city, but it's divided, and yet into two, and cannot be kind of reconciled into the one. So the unconscious is the stroke within subjectivity, and that's why Lacan has he denotes the subject as a barred S, an S with
Mm.
a stroke through it.
Mm.
And the stroke is kind of the unconscious.
Sure. Wow. I really like that, Pete.
And
Dang.
Sapanchek's great.
Oh,
Sapanchek's very, very good.
yes, I really like that book. So, okay, going back to kind of different things that you're up to, I want to maybe bring two things together. You know, I discovered that you do this thing called Atheism for Lent, which I thought was brilliant. And so I'm
Yeah.
wondering if you could just maybe speak about that, but then also still connected to Boothby's work and your work around Christianity and Lacanian psychoanalysis. How do you end up thinking about, God, God? Like,
Yeah.
because I think there's going to be people that are listening to this, so they're going to think, oh, some kind of monotheistic deity up in the sky, and there's a place for that, I guess, in some traditions. But what do you mean when you talk about God?
Yes. Yeah. That's a great question. I think, um, like, there is a sense in which one could argue that some concept of God um, is universal. There's a universal uh, dimension to speaking subjects, the subjects of language, that kind of like where I know Nietzsche once said, if you want to give up God, you'll have to give up grammar.
Have
Like
to give
there's
up
something,
grammar, right?
yeah, so there's something inherent within language itself. And Lacan calls this the big other.
Mm.
And um, okay, let's break this down in the best way possible. How we do that? Well, you think about it like the incest taboo in anthropology, or what's castration in
Castration, yeah.
psychoanalysis. Yeah, is the idea that the infant eventually has to separate from the mother other to become a separate self in the world, go into the world. So, and that's why anthropologists find the incest to be universal. And so and at its most simple, that just means at some point we separate from the other. And enter into the world. And if there's a problem here, that's psychosis, really, in psychoanalytic terms. There's some problem with that division. But with that division, um, uh, you're marked by a sense of lack.
Mm.
Uh, you're marked by a sense of loss. But the trick is, you haven't lost anything. You are the result of the loss. It's not that you exist in oceanic oneness with everything and then separate out. It's like through the separation, the ego is formed, really as maybe even as a symptom, as a defense against this loss. So that means we are kind of marked by some fundamental loss, and that could be described as the religious experience in some ways, without without oversimplifying. That's the traditional religious experience, that there is something, I don't feel whole, I feel that I've lost something, and I want to kind of return to that and get that back. So in one sense, that notion, that feeling could be seen as universal. The trick for me, and what's the kind of, as we wrestle through the meaning of the word God, and this is what Atheism for Lent does over
Okay.
6 weeks, we go through basically all the main concepts, is eventually you start by thinking that I am lacking. There's something I don't have, and you experience guilt, which is I am not who I want to be, meaninglessness, I am not who I want to be, or these experiences of a lack, and you fantasize something that will complete you. Now, in our contemporary society, it's not God in traditional form, it's psychedelic, sexual liberation, commodity satisfaction, the same thing, right? What will make me whole and complete? What will take away the lack? What will take away this feeling of being incomplete? And we fantasize, the answer to that. I'll say this very quickly.
Sure.
In traditional societies, God was the one non-castrated subject, right? So
Mm.
we're all castrated, as in we all lost something. This, by the way, is what I mean by life after death, right?
Okay.
That there is life after death, and we are the evidence of it. That there is something of a death that we have to go through in order to live, and that's castration. There's a pound of flesh
Mm.
that is absolutely central to the coming to birth as a subject. We experience a loss. And in traditional societies, God is the one non-castrated other. And it was kind of, it had its problems, but the great thing was we were all castrated. Me and you and everybody, we're all castrated, with one exception. Now, the exception might also be the Lord and the lady who lived down the road, and
Sure.
eventually might fight them over, kill them or whatever, right? But we're all unified by being castrated, and there's maybe one exception, and
Mm.
that's the kind of the God the Father. In modern society, we live in a society where you don't have to be castrated, where some social media, you're surrounded by people who seem to be whole and complete and seem to be offering you the answer on how to be achieve and how to be everything you want to be. So in the modern society, there's a notion that I don't have to be castrated. Now, the problem with this is it generates jealousies and envies.
Mm.
Creates social division and social fragmentation, because everyone seems to be happy except for you, and the more the more you try to do it, the more anxiety it produces, the more
So
problem.
true.
Yeah. So the answer to this, right now, the fake answer, let's do the fake answer first, is the fake answer to this kind of progressive problem, the problem of progressive society, is to return to a tyrannical God, a God where we're all castrated, right? And so there's definitely a temptation within people to get rid of the anxiety produced by progressive society by going to some sort of kind of fascist possibility, right? But it never fully works, because
Mm.
the fascist is the one who enjoys their castration. So if it's a religious person who says, "Oh, you shouldn't have sex before marriage," um, they always will say, and that's the best way to have sex. In other words, the most enjoyable way to have sex is not to have sex with marriage. So it's
Mm.
not quite feudal society where, because we're all castrated and we're all a bit unhappy. It's almost like in order to be happy, you have to put on these constraints. So it's already within the progressive frame. This old frame is gone, you know. So one is you can't really do it, but you will notice that in our society, I know people in LA who would go back to conservative churches to date because they
Mm.
couldn't date in the open thing where they're able to date and have sex with whoever they want. They couldn't date anybody. But by going to somewhere like Hillsong, they, with all its prohibitions, they find it easier to date, right? So people will return to that, but it doesn't work. The answer for me is to realize that we're all castrated, including the absolute, right? So
Mm.
if in stage one, we're all castrated except for some exception. And in stage two, nobody has to be castrated, right? It's the God of the demand to enjoy, which Zizek would call it, the God who demands uncastrated enjoyment. And he says, you can be whole and complete, psychedelic enlightenment, polyamory, sexual liberation, commodity sales, whatever you want, you can be whole and complete. Then the power, what I'm interested in with radical theology and what I call power theology is the move that you realize that we are all castrated, including God. And by God, all I mean by that is you can mean it in any way, but reality itself is divided. There
Yeah.
is something about reality itself, and everything at the quantum level is called indeterminacy, right?
Mm.
In mathematics is called incompleteness, right? In biology it's called evolution. There's in politics is called democracy, but that there's a type of non-oneness that generates everything. And the fantasy of wholeness and completeness is an idol, as an idolatry that is universal. And so for me, God in its most radical form, in its Hegelian form, is summed up in the phrase, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is summed up in the notion of a self-divided God. That
Mm.
you realize, and in a very basic way, it's like when a kid feels, oh, I'm weak and I'm rubbish and I can't do anything. And then they discover, they think their parents are perfect and amazing and are gods. And then they realize their parents are just as broken as they are. But there's something about that realization that it's not just me that's lacking. My parents are lacking, and we're unified in that shared lack that is
Mm.
free. And in the same way for me in religion is you think God's is whole and complete and God's going to fix everything and God can take away all the suffering. But actually what you'll find is a suffering God, that suffering absolute. There's something about struggle, sacrifice, and struggle that is inherent to society, inherent to humanity, and it's actually where all the best parts of being human come from.
Wow. You know, I haven't read it, but the other day I was just doing some research, and I think Zizek has a book entitled The Fragile Absolute.
Yes, yes, it's a great
And
book.
that just resonated with me. That kind of Hegelian understanding of a divided God. And man, I'm picking up what you're putting down. Like I'm definitely in your corner. I love that way of
Thank
looking
you.
at things. And I actually think it has a lot of value for people that aren't religious. You
Yes. Oh
know,
yeah.
I end up talking about quote unquote like Hegelian theology with people who could give a rat's ass about, traditional Christianity, and it resonates with them.
Oh, 100%. I'm getting more interest in people who have never darkened the door of church, no interest in religion, but whenever I talk about the kind of like secular society as a place of wholeness and completeness and
Sure.
optimizing life and all of that, and what I'm advocating is a type of Christology of lack, of in which we embrace and celebrate a type of dividedness within all of reality. They're
Wow.
like, I can buy into that. I thought
Yeah.
I had to buy into some belief in God or something. No, you're talking about a form of being worth. And here's the radical theology's critique of society is fascinating. So there's a story from Ireland about these three guys who enter a competition to build a sheep pen. So they have to build a sheep pen, and the one with the biggest sheep pen that can fit the most sheep wins, right? Now, truth is, that sounds like there'd be no such TV program. But when I was a kid, probably the most popular TV show on a Saturday night was called One Man and His Dog, where a man would whistle to his dog and his dog would get sheep together in a pen. So it's not unlikely. Anyway, the Paddy Englishman, Paddy Irishman, Paddy Scotsman, they all enter the competition. The Scotsman builds this sheep pen that can fit 50 sheep. The Englishman builds a sheep pen that can fit 100 sheep. But this guy Seamus, the Irish guy, he doesn't bother doing anything for a while. Just sits, gets an Irish tan, goes red, and he realized he only got half an hour left. So he grabs 4 pieces of wood and he puts one in front of him, one behind, and one on either side, and puts some nails into them just as the judges are coming. And the judges laugh at him and they say, "Listen, that sheep pen's tiny. Like you couldn't even fit one sheep in it. Sure, you can hardly fit in it." And Seamus turns around and says, "What are you talking about?" He says, "I'm not standing in the sheep pen. You're standing in the sheep pen."
Mm.
Right? In other words, the sheep pen is the entire world except for that little bit, right?
Wow.
That's the temple in the profane Christianity I'm describing, is that people laugh at the church and say, "Oh, you're the ones like seeking wholeness and completeness and the sacred, this kind of like oceanic oneness." And the profane temple is where you go like, "No, no, no, you're standing in that." Our society is riven and is awash with promises of wholeness and completeness and
Oh
getting
yeah.
rid of. We need a little tiny space in our week, a little desert in the oasis of life where we can go to escape that that tyrannical happiness, that tyrannical fulfillment, to escape the tyranny of happiness.
I don't know if this will resonate with you, but just in light of that, one of the things I tell my clients, to some people it sounds insane, is when they come in wanting to be happier, I'm like, I don't believe in happiness. My role is to help you kind of embrace your unhappiness
Yes. Oh,
and
100%.
your dissatisfaction.
Yeah, like it's absolutely true. And whenever like in LA, I remember whenever I'm talking, a line that I would sometimes use, which is kind of adapted from Kierkegaard, is I would say to people, "Listen, I'm not telling you I'm not actually saying that you should be unhappy. I'm not like, it sounds like I'm preaching despair. It sounds like I'm trying to make you unhappy. I'm not trying to make you unhappy." And I say, "I'm telling you that you're already unhappy, but you just don't
Mm,
know it." Right. And as
mm,
soon as I say that line, it resonates, particularly with people who were in LA, because it's like you're running around doing everything, like being happy, going to all the parties, doing drugs, doing all these things. And it feels whatever, but actually beneath the surface, there's this profound unhappiness. Now, the unhappiness is not subjective, it's objective. It's in your symptoms, right? So
mm.
you're not even aware of it. It's manifesting in your life in explosions of anger, or in doing something very destructive with a friend, or whatever it is. It's your depression is kind of finding a way to manifest. But when you kind of go, one is there's maybe an unhappiness that's within the society of plentitude. The demand to enjoy generates an unhappiness that you can't even fully symbolize. You can't
Mm.
even fully say it. And then the answer is not to get happy, but is to embrace your unhappiness and to make space for your unhappiness. And of course, the ultimate dialectic move is by weirdly embracing your unhappiness and symbolizing it, you're freed from the negative weight of that unhappiness. You become happy in
Yeah.
your unhappiness.
Yes. Oh, that's so good. Okay, Pete, can I ask you this? Because I want to be sensitive to your time. I know I have to get off in just a little bit, but
Yeah.
could I ask you kind of one other kind of big question that will bring together, I think, what you do at the festival Wake, which I want to hear more about. I guess one of the last questions I asked Richard Boothby, which we both kind of didn't know how to answer, was, is it possible to have a community or a collective around some of these ideas that we're exploring today? Because it is not what I think the institutional church or many religions are kind of offering. Have you
Yeah.
found a way to kind of bring people together and have, I don't know if it's practices or rituals or just a sense of community? Because I struggle with that.
Yeah.
Not being a part of the church anymore and trying to pave my own path. It can be lonely sometimes. It can feel like there's not others to connect with.
Yeah. Yeah. And and maybe this is the most, out of everything we're talking about and everything I've done, maybe this is the most uh uh controversial bit of it, is that
Okay.
I want to very confidently say that we can, right?
Okay.
That's the controversy, because I understand the critiques, and I understand a lot of people are very cautious that you could ever build something around these ideas.
Sure.
But my belief and my commitment is to the answer that it can be done. And I often use the difference between a community and a communion. So a
Okay.
community, I will often define as a community is a group of people gathered around a shared set of beliefs or shared set of actions, right? So they are a shared enemy. A shared set of beliefs or a shared enemy is two great ways to be a community, right?
Yes.
We all identify in some way with the same thing, and we all dislike that person, right?
Right.
We scapegoat to some other, and that's community. Communion is, I want to say, a group of people gathered around a shared loss.
Mm,
So when you think of communion as in it's a meal around the death of God, the loss of God, right? Do this in remembrance of me. So the ultimate communion is a group of people gathered around the death of God. We haven't even touched on what the death of God means, but wake as the festival, it's a wake for God in a way. It's a wake is the Irish, death kind of funeral ritual.
sure.
Um, and we gathered around to remember that loss. So communion, AAA is a type of communion because you're kind of gathered around a shared trauma and a
Mm,
shared kind of like, again, not you don't have something in common. In AAA, you've got people who are rich and poor and conservative and liberal and all of that, but unified, joined together by a shared kind of like a void and
mm,
pain around alcohol. So for me, it is possible to have a communion, a group of people who gather. And I think Burning Man at its best is an example of this, like originally and still is to a certain extent, you gather around a shared destruction, the destruction of the man and of the temple, right? And so what unifies everybody is not what you share in common, but that you're all unified around this shared destructive, the shared loss. Now, I
mm,
think that's what makes us all humans. I think this is what connects everybody, is that what unifies me to you is not our language or gender or sexuality or anything like that. Those those are in the level of the imaginary and those separate us. But where we're unified is as subjects, we are all marked by death. We are all marked by castration. We are all marked by loss. And a communion is a type of you can build a church which is a type of collective or communion of the contradiction, where a group
mm.
of people come together to embrace that shared loss through art, through music, through comedy, and allow that experience to go through them. So that's the work, and that's what that's what I do with Wake. But what I call transformance art is the
Okay.
attempt to see a church of the contradiction.
Church of the Contradiction. Wow, that's powerful. I know this is maybe more like traditional psychological language, but is what you're talking about is connecting through vulnerability and a type of human fragility.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in many ways it is. And it's kind of like, but it's the most fundamental kind of vulnerability. It's it's going right to the heart
Mm,
of a fundamental loss and seeing like dialectically, because I do know actually there's various thinkers and people like Brené Brown, I think talks about
yeah,
this.
yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking of.
Yeah, so there's a power in this vulnerability. And like basically you know, we have a fantasy today, a very common fantasy that we want to sacrifice, that we
Mm,
want to get to the end of our job or work life and hopefully be able to sit by a beach and do nothing. And we're working hard, we're sacrificing in a very painful way, but we fantasize, is there some way through winning the lottery or whatever that I can get out of this and I can just live this life without sacrifice?
yes.
And the sad thing is when people do that, they very quickly realize that their life is becomes melancholic and meaningless because without sacrifice, there's no meaning, right? But the problem is in our contemporary society, we sacrifice, but we sacrifice without most of us being able to get the benefit of the sacrifice. Some people get
Mm,
the benefit, and most of us don't. Um, but the answer is not to get rid of sacrifice. What we need is sacrifice and struggle and vulnerability and a sense of loss, like and gift. Gift is very key. So in
mm,
economy, you give something, you get something in return. In a gift, you give without return. So gift is a type of sacrifice because you're giving without return. So um, with if we lose gift, if we lose sacrifice, if we lose struggle, we will lose the very ability to have a depth and a vitality and a meaning to life. And so, yeah, so the collective of the contradiction, these spaces are places that are able to allow us to um, orient ourselves
Mm,
to that vulnerability, to that loss, to that struggle, and to turn it into something good.
I love it. Does this sort of connect with I know we briefly touched on it in the beginning, the difference between enjoyment and pleasure?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a great distinction. A very
Yeah, I
important.
was hoping you could riff on that.
Oh yeah, because in a nutshell, we often think of in pleasure being getting something you like. So at Christmas, you get a present and you enjoy it, or your football team wins and it gives you
Right.
pleasure. Uh, but in psychoanalysis, they kind of distinguish these a little bit and say, well, enjoyment is the happiness you get from not getting what you want, right?
Mm,
So if your football team always wins, you won't find yourself getting increasingly happy every win. There'll be a peak, and then there'll be a certain point where the next win doesn't make you as happy, and then actually you get frustrated by the win. So when I moved
mm.
to America, I don't do sports at all. So I got
I don't really either.
so I was like into basketball. I thought I'll pick basketball. So I decided my team would be the global, what do they call it? The global, oh, what's the name?
The,
Harlem Globetrotters.
the
Harlem
Harlem
Globetrotters.
Globetrotters.
Yeah. And those guys never lose. I've never seen them lose. They're always playing the Generals. They never lose. My enjoyment dies because they never lose. I need them to lose. But so the enjoyment is really when your team, you're going through the struggle, the difficult
Mm,
times, dark times. No, you need the odd win, right? The pleasure, you get the
sure.
odd win, and that's fantastic. And then the enjoyment is in the 4 years between each World Cup, right? Or the
Mm.
enjoyment of the child, which is waiting for the present before they get it. And we all know that it's more fun for the kid waiting for the present than what the present will ever be, right?
Oh,
That's why if you're
absolutely.
booking a holiday, yeah, book a holiday, make sure you book it well in advance so you get the enjoy, because you're paying for the enjoyment as well as the pleasure. So
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
maximize that.
Do you think the whole dynamic around, you know, orgasm being kind of a pleasurable thing, but then the build up and the anticipation, maybe even the frustration of not getting sex and maybe fighting and that the whole process is probably more around the enjoyment.
Oh, 100%. I mean, this is why, like, and again, one of the reasons why in some places like Los Angeles, I use that as an example a lot because I
Sure.
live there, but it is a great example where something that robs sexuality of its sex. And so sex isn't sexual. That's the Freudian insight. The Freudian insight is not so much, oh, we're always thinking about sex when we're doing other things. Freud's more interested, Zizek says this really well. He says, Freud's more interested in what we have to think about when we're having sex, right?
Mm.
Other animals don't have to think about anything. They don't need like all of these fantasies and candles and meals or like kind of fetishistic objects to mate, right? They mate. We, in a sense, can't have sex. That's our problem. And you've read Sapanchik. What is sex? Like we are fundamentally rubbish at just having sex,
Mm.
right? We have to have phantasmic structures, and sometimes that is bringing someone out for a meal, buying a meal for someone, buying a present for someone, kind of certain kind of like clues, certain things. And a lot of a relationship is about trying to figure out what it is for the other that makes sex sexual, right? Because
Oh,
sex
100%.
and without so with pure pleasure, where it's almost like it's sex on demand, uh, that actually can rob sex of its sexuality and make sex traumatic again. I mean, I
Mm.
sometimes joke that in America they had to invent a technology to make sex enjoyable again called the purity ring, right? Where kids put on a purity ring to say they're not going to have sex, which would make them want to have sex. And I supposedly there's even studies that say people have more sex when they have a purity ring, right? But it makes sense that you kind of almost need the obstacle. Like that's what the chaperone was.
Mm.
Uh, Traditionally, they talked about we use this term making love to make love. Traditionally, it wasn't the couple that made love; it was the chaperone, and the chaperone would make love because two people would start fantasizing about what they could do if the chaperone wasn't there to stop them. So the chaperone was an obstacle stopping the two people from doing anything. But by stopping them from doing anything, their fantasies started to get sparked, and
Yeah.
say the chaperone made love.
Oh, that's awesome, man. Wow. So, okay, Pete, let me ask you this. Is there anything else around who you are, events that are coming up, just your work in general that you would want to kind of throw out there that maybe I've missed asking you that's really important to you?
Oh, thank you. Actually, you mentioned atheism for Lent. We talked a little bit
Okay.
around that, but that's actually coming up in a little bit. And just to give you a brief overview of what that's
Please,
about,
please.
is kind of what happens each week of Lent. I mean, in Lent, people want to give something up, give up chocolate, give up whatever. So this is you give up God for Lent, right? But
That's great.
yeah, but what this does is I want to show how we think of theism and atheism as enemies. Often
Mm,
we think of them as opposites, but actually they've always danced together in a very interesting way, enriching each other, critiquing each other. And so in Atheism for Lent, the first week now, the first few days is it gives you the traditional notion of God. So you get a reflection for every day. And the first week is gives you the traditional notion of God. The second week gives you a whole week of the what would be called sometimes new atheism or the standard atheistic critique. So the second week you get into the antithesis. You've got the thesis God, you've got the antithesis atheism.
gotcha.
Then the third week brings in the mystics. And the
Mm,
mystics, interestingly, bring on all of the critiques of the atheists and then do something that's kind of theological with it. And then the fourth week, we get into kind of the materialists and the people like Marx and Freud, who then critique the mystics. And
mm,
then we look at, and so each week we look at there's a thesis and then there's an antithesis, and then that antithesis becomes a new thesis, that there's a new antithesis, and you start to move towards kind of this interesting thing in which thesis and antithesis, light and dark, theism and atheism start to get closer and closer, dancing more and more until they weave into each other in this really radical way until we
wow.
come to this notion of the self-divided absolute that you get in Boothby and McGowan and others.
Wow.
So
In
if
some
people
way,
want to join me on that, they can find it.
oh, that's amazing. Yeah, and I'll include it in the show notes, but you have a website that people can just go to. Is it PeteRollins.com? Excuse
PeterRollins.com.
me, PeterRollins.com. Does this resonate with you? I feel like when you talk and connect some of these ideas, you kind of sound like, are you familiar with Dietrich Bonhoeffer
Oh, yes. Yeah.
and the letters and papers from prison, which is really the work that I really enjoy, and his
Yes.
idea of a religionless Christianity?
Oh yes, 100%. That's the
Okay.
only one offer that I like. Uh,
Okay.
yeah, the letters and papers, and this they're incredible. Like what's in there is incredible, and I he's been those letters and papers very influential.
Okay.
I actually they're usually in Atheism for Lent. I've changed all of the reflections this year, so I
Oh,
don't know
nice.
here, but I teach on that stuff, and I really do think that Bonhoeffer is in this tradition that
Okay.
I'm part of.
Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. Well, Pete, I hope this isn't the last time that we connect. Man, I'd love to go to Ireland at some point. I've never
Oh yeah.
been, and it just seems like an awesome place. I don't know if you watch much TV, but there's this incredible show called Bad Sisters on Apple Plus that's set in Ireland, and it's just gorgeous. It's a phenomenal show, but it really highlights like the landscape and the culture, and so my wife and I got really into it. So
Oh,
we've
I
been
haven't
wanting
watched it.
to.
I haven't watched that. But here, yeah, you have to get out, man. Anytime. You're always welcome. I'll show you around. So I don't know the south as well as the north because I live in
Okay.
the north. So come to the north, come to Belfast, and yeah, I'll show you and your wife really good time here. It's really good fun, great people. I mean, I've been away from home for 15 years. I just got back 6 weeks ago,
Oh,
and
wow.
been lovely. Now I may move back to America in a year's time, but I wanted to come home for a bit, and
Yeah,
I've loved it.
sure. Well, if
Loved
you're
it.
ever in the Houston area, you've got a place to stay too. And I've got a shit ton of, I don't know if you drink bourbon, but
Oh yeah. Oh,
we
I
could,
do. Although I'm more of a gin guy because
okay,
when
you're
I
more of
was
a gin
young,
guy.
I got so drunk on whiskey that whiskey and bourbon sometimes still brings back that bad memory.
Got you.
I love Houston, by the way. It's one of my favorite cities, and
Oh,
one of
it's
my
a great
favorite
city.
places in the world. Yeah, is the Rothko Chapel.
Oh, I love the Rothko Chapel.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. Maybe he's probably one of my favorite artists. And
Mm.
or no, sorry. Well, Barnett Newman, sorry, is one of my favorite artists. And Barnett Newman has a sculpture outside the Rothko Chapel.
Yes.
And then the Rothko Chapel itself is just phenomenal. And I think of that as a type
Yeah.
of union of the contradiction.
Yes. Yes. And kind of the empty space that you were talking about. No, that's so good.
Yeah.
Okay, so would you mind just ending by saying the line of the podcast, which is just continue the conversation?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I heard that when I was listening to the podcast with Richard Boothby. I love that. So, yeah, I would very happily say continue the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you.